Have you ever fallen into a phase where everything that once defined you suddenly becomes unclear? When the things you were once certain about no longer hold, when motivation disappears without any clear reason, when you no longer know where you are going, even though you once felt so sure. Why is it that some people, after breaking down, rise again stronger, while others remain trapped in a prolonged state of disorientation? And what if what you are calling a breakdown is not truly a collapse at all, but something that carries a different meaning you have never yet recognized? From the perspective of Carl Jung, a psychological breakdown is the psyche's response when the structure you are living within no longer aligns with who you are inside. When the distance between the person you present and the person you truly are becomes too great, that structure is forced to collapse. What you experience as disorientation, emptiness, or fragmentation is, in fact, the unconscious being compelled to enter consciousness. Not to destroy you, but to remove what is no longer true. And if that is the case, then the question is no longer how to escape the breakdown, but what you will do with it. Will you try to return to your former version and repeat the same cycle? Or will you pause long enough to understand what is truly unfolding within you? If you are in this very in-between space, where nothing has fully ended yet nothing has truly begun again, where the breakdown still lingers, then this message is a reminder. This is not the moment to rush forward, but the moment to clearly see the path you actually need to walk. Part 1. Jung and the perspective on psychological breakdown. Carl Jung did not approach a breakdown as a random event. He saw it as a structured movement unfolding from within the psyche. After separating from Sigmund Freud, whom he had once regarded as a mentor and an intellectual anchor, Jung entered a phase in which all familiar frames of reference fell away. There was no longer a guiding center, no longer a clear system of orientation, and he drifted in a suspended state where nothing was defined as it had been before. What unfolded during that time were deep and complex inner experiences. Images arose that he could not explain. Dreams carried a lingering sense of unease. An inner world gradually lost the stability it once held. From the outside, it was a phase easily judged as a crisis. But for Jung, it was not a meaningless rupture. It was a process unfolding according to a deeper logic. Jung did not try to suppress what was happening. He did not rush to return to his former state. Instead, he chose to remain. He recorded, sketched, observed, and interpreted what emerged within him. This was not surrender, but a conscious form of confrontation in which he allowed the inner process to run its full course. And from that persistence, a new structure began to take shape. Not a restoration of the former version, but the emergence of an entirely different understanding of the human being. The foundations of analytical psychology, the concepts of the unconscious, symbols, and psychological transformation, all were formed during the very period that, from the outside, could be seen as a breakdown. This leads to an important realization. Collapse is not an interruption of the journey. In many cases, it is the condition that allows the journey to truly begin. Jung once wrote that his life was the story of the self-realization of the unconscious. It was not a pursuit of success, nor a return to stability, but a process in which the unrecognized parts gradually entered consciousness. From this perspective, a psychological breakdown is no longer a flaw to be fixed. It is a response of the psyche when the current structure no longer fits. When what you are living no longer reflects who you are inside, the psyche will not continue to sustain it. It must break it apart, not to weaken you, but to remove what is no longer accurate. So the important question is not how to stop it. The question is whether you can understand what is taking place. Every feeling of disorientation, every void you cannot name, carries a specific signal. If you only try to escape it, you will miss that signal. But if you remain long enough to observe, you will begin to see something clearly. There is a gap between the person you have grown familiar with and the person you truly are. And it is precisely at this point that change begins. Not by adding more, but by facing directly what has just collapsed. Seeing how it was formed, how you identified with it, and why it can no longer stand. When you see that clearly, the need to return disappears. You move into a different phase, where rebuilding yourself is no longer driven by habit or pressure, but by a more accurate understanding of who you are. Part 2. How to rebuild yourself after a psychological breakdown. Number 1. Allow the collapse of the persona to unfold. A psychological breakdown is not simply a state of exhaustion or a loss of motivation. It is a sign that the structure you have been using to operate your life no longer works. What causes panic is not just the event itself, but the fact that you can no longer hold on to your image of yourself as before. You once knew who you were, what you were good at, and where you were going. But after the breakdown, all of that is no longer certain. The common reaction in this phase is to try to return to the previous state. You want to stabilize quickly, regain your form, and prove that you are still in control of your life. But that very effort prolongs the crisis, because you are trying to restore a structure that no longer fits. According to Carl Jung, that structure is the persona, the image you construct to adapt to society. It is the role you have become familiar with, the capable one, the reliable one, the strong one, the one who always does things right. You do not just use that role, you identify with it. So when the persona collapses, you do not feel like you have lost a role. You feel like you have lost yourself. But this is the point that needs to be seen clearly. You have not lost yourself. You have only lost a form of expression that is no longer true. A person who worked for many years in a corporate environment, consistently recognized for performance and control over work, fell into a prolonged state of burnout. When he could no longer maintain the same pace, he did not just lose his performance, he lost his sense of worth. The reason was not that he had become weaker, but that his entire sense of value was attached to a single role. When that role was no longer there, he had nothing else to stand on. This is the mechanism of the collapse of the persona. So the first step in rebuilding yourself is not to recover quickly, but to stop trying to recover. You need to allow something to end. No fixing, no patching, no immediate replacement. If you rush to build a new image, you will repeat the same mistake, only with a different appearance. This requires a very specific shift in behavior. You stop forcing yourself to produce answers about the future when there is not yet enough clarity. You do not try to present stability when in reality you are not stable. You do not chase a new goal just to escape the feeling of emptiness. These actions are not avoidance. They are how you disconnect from the old mechanism. Carl Jung stated clearly, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, It will direct your life, and you will call it fate. When you live entirely within the persona, you are operating according to a script you are not aware of. A breakdown occurs when that script can no longer sustain itself. If you do not stop to look at it, you will continue to be driven by another version of the same script. In reality, you will recognize this through certain signs. You lose motivation for things that once mattered deeply. You no longer find meaning in goals that once drove you. Continuing along the old path begins to feel forced. This is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign that you no longer fit the old structure. Instead of trying to fix this feeling, you need to use it as data. It tells you that your previous direction is no longer accurate. If you ignore this signal and continue, you will return to a state of breakdown in a short time. Allowing the persona to collapse means accepting that you are no longer the person you once were. You do not need to immediately redefine who you will become. You only need to stop maintaining an image that is no longer true. This is the minimum step, but it is essential. Without it, every effort to rebuild afterward lacks a foundation. At this stage, progress is not measured by achievements or external results. It is measured by the extent to which you no longer have to strain to maintain a role. When you begin to feel less need to prove yourself, less need to uphold an image, that is a sign you are separating from the persona. You cannot rebuild yourself while still trying to hold on to the version that has already collapsed. And you cannot build a new foundation without accepting the removal of the old one. This is not an emotional preference. It is a psychological requirement. So in this first step, the only requirement is clarity. Identify what is no longer fitting. Stop maintaining it. Do not rush to replace it. When you can do that, you have completed the most difficult part of the rebuilding process. If you have ever experienced the disorientation that comes when a part of who you are collapses, share in the comments. What within you is no longer fitting, yet you held onto it for too long. Sometimes, naming it clearly not only helps you see yourself more accurately, but it also helps others realize they are not the only ones going through this phase. Number 2. Confront the darkness within. If the first step forces you to stop maintaining a collapsed image, then the second step asks something far more difficult, to face directly what appears after that pause. When you are no longer occupied with holding a role together, a range of psychological states begins to surface more clearly. You may notice that you become more easily triggered, more vulnerable, and more reactive than usual. Not because you have become weaker, but because the parts that were once tightly controlled are no longer being suppressed. This is where many people begin to misinterpret what is happening. They assume the breakdown has made them worse, so they immediately try to adjust their behavior. They try to be calmer, more positive, more disciplined. But the more they try to control themselves, the more tension they feel. The reason is simple. They are dealing with outward expressions without understanding the inner structure. The reactions that are surfacing are not problems to be eliminated immediately. They are signals that need to be decoded. Carl Jung referred to all of these parts as the shadow. These are emotions, reactions, and thoughts that have existed within you for a long time, but have never been directly addressed. You have been used to adjusting your behavior to fit circumstances, so you rarely question the deeper causes within yourself. When a breakdown occurs, Your capacity to regulate decreases, and what lies beneath begins to appear more clearly. A person working in a high-pressure environment may realize that he always feels irritated when others work slowly. Previously, he saw this simply as a standard of performance. But when he no longer has enough energy to remain composed, the reaction intensifies. On closer observation, he recognizes that this irritation does not come only from efficiency concerns, but from a need for control. If others do not follow his pace, he feels unsafe. This is not a problem of others, but an internal psychological structure he has never examined. This is the core of this step. You do not try to fix your reactions immediately. You seek to understand where they come from. When you notice yourself reacting strongly to a situation, you do not stop at, "I should not be like this." You go one step further. What within me is being touched? This shift in questioning changes the entire direction of the process. Instead of resisting yourself, you begin to analyze yourself. Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Recognizing the shadow is not about becoming more negative. It is about no longer being driven by what you do not understand. When a reaction is brought into awareness, it loses its automatic nature. You may still feel anger, still feel discomfort, but you are no longer carried away by it as before. From the perspective of modern psychology, this approach aligns with methods such as psychodynamic therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. Instead of eliminating negative emotions, they are brought into conscious awareness. When an emotion is accurately named, the automatic response decreases, and the capacity to observe and regulate behavior increases. Techniques such as journaling or self-reflection are not merely formalities. They help clarify the internal psychological structure and reduce unconscious influence, something Jung described philosophically and is now supported at the neurological level. Facing the shadow does not mean rationalizing every behavior. You do not use understanding yourself as an excuse for losing control. On the contrary, you maintain enough distance to observe without being swept away. You acknowledge the emotion, identify its source, and then adjust your behavior consciously. In practice, this step unfolds through very specific observations. You notice that you consistently avoid certain conversations. You notice that you procrastinate when faced with uncertainty. You notice how strongly you are affected by the judgments of others. These patterns may have always existed, but were not clear enough to capture your attention. When a breakdown occurs, they become visible because you no longer have the energy to conceal them. If you skip this stage and move into action too quickly, you will carry all of these unresolved parts with you. That is why many people, after overcoming one crisis, encounter the same issues again in a different context. They change their circumstances, but not their internal structure. So in this second step, your task is not to become better, but to become clearer. Clear about how you react. Clear about what you are avoiding. Clear about your actual weaknesses, not the ones you once assumed. As clarity increases, you begin to gain the ability to choose rather than react. You cannot build a stable version of yourself if parts of you remain unseen. And you cannot eliminate the shadow. You can only integrate it. This is not an easy step, but without it, every step that follows lacks a foundation. Number 3. Accept the sacred period of solitude. After you stop trying to maintain your old image and begin to clearly recognize your inner movements, a state will almost certainly arise, a sense of separation. You no longer fit into your old rhythm of life, but you do not yet belong to a new structure. Once familiar things begin to feel distant. Relationships that once felt close no longer carry the same sense of resonance. You speak less, explain less, and in many cases, you intentionally withdraw from interactions that are no longer necessary. Many people call this loneliness, but in essence, it is a necessary psychological restructuring. What needs to be clearly distinguished here is that this is not an isolation born of injury, but separation with a function. In Jungian psychology, this process is often understood as a transitional phase, where the individual gradually detaches from external influences in order to form a more independent inner structure. When you're no longer operating based on social expectations or familiar roles, you need a quiet enough space to observe and recalibrate yourself. Without that space, you will quickly be pulled back into old patterns. In reality, this state is often accompanied by discomfort. You may feel out of sync with those around you. Conversations that were once effortless now feel forced. You lose interest in familiar topics, yet you do not yet have the language to express what you are going through. This can lead you to doubt yourself, even to believe that you are becoming distant or difficult to connect with. But if seen accurately, this is not a decline in your ability to connect. It is a sign that you are redefining your standards for connection. Carl Jung once wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." The loneliness in this phase does not arise because no one is there, but because what is happening within you cannot yet be accurately shared within your old environment. This is a temporary but necessary distance, allowing you to clarify what truly matters to you. This sacred space of solitude creates enough distance between you and your previous environment so that you are not pulled back into old ways of living. At the same time, it allows you to build a new frame of reference, not based on comparison or external expectations, but on your own direct experience. When Jesus Christ entered the wilderness for 40 days, it was not an act of escaping the world, but a phase of detaching from all familiar supports to face himself directly. A similar logic appears in the deliberate choice of Henry David Thoreau, known for his work Walden. He intentionally withdrew from society to live alone by Walden Pond for 2 years. This was not isolation imposed by circumstance, but a conscious decision to step away from the patterns that shaped his thinking and way of life. In that space, he did not seek to become different, but to become more accurate with himself. He wrote, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately." Free from the influence of external rhythms, he was able to examine his entire value system, keep what truly mattered, and discard what existed only out of habit or social pressure. However, it is important to emphasize that accepting solitude does not mean completely cutting yourself off from the world. The issue is not whether you communicate, but the quality of that communication. During this phase, you may consciously choose truly necessary interactions while reducing connections driven by habit or obligation. This is not a shrinking of your world, but a restructuring of how you relate to it. A common misunderstanding is that people try to escape loneliness by filling their time with activity, work, or new relationships. This may bring short-term relief, but in the long run, it disrupts the inner adjustment process. When you constantly avoid the feeling of emptiness, you deny yourself the chance to understand what needs to change. In contrast, when you allow yourself to remain in that state, you begin to see the changes unfolding more clearly. In practice, you can begin with very concrete actions. Spend time alone without attaching it to a specific goal. Limit interactions that pull you back into old roles. Notice the changes in how you think, feel, and respond. These actions are not meant to produce immediate results, but to maintain an environment stable enough for the restructuring process to take place. At its core, this period of solitude is not passive. It is a phase of deep inner work. You are separating from influences that no longer fit, while building a new foundation for how you think and choose. If you skip or shorten this phase, you risk returning to old patterns because you do not yet have enough clarity to replace them. So in this third step, the requirement is not to seek more connection, but to accept a necessary distance. You do not need to turn it into an ideal state. You only need to stop resisting it. When you can sustain this space long enough, you will begin to notice an important shift. You no longer need external validation to know who you are. You begin to form a clearer internal anchor. This becomes the foundation for the next stage of rebuilding yourself, where your choices no longer come from pressure, but from a more accurate understanding of yourself. And to reach that point, you need to move through this phase fully, without avoidance, without shortening it, and without replacing it with temporary solutions. I know you fear loneliness, not because no one is around you, but because in those quiet moments, you are forced to face yourself more clearly than ever before. But if what you have just heard makes you think, if it helps you recognize something within yourself that you have never been able to name before, then leave a like and subscribe. It is a way of staying steady, of not turning away the moment you touch something important. Some journeys do not need noise, but they do need to be continued. And if you are on that journey, sometimes simply staying a little longer is already a step forward. Number 4. Turn inner pain into the momentum to move forward. After you have gone through the phase of recognition and no longer avoid what is happening within, a question begins to emerge with greater clarity. What will you do with everything you have experienced? Pain, in itself, does not automatically create change. Some people carry their wounds for years without moving forward. Others, from the very point of collapse, rebuild the entire direction of their lives. The difference does not lie in the intensity of the pain, but in how you process the energy that pain generates. From the perspective of Carl Jung, pain is not a state to be eliminated, but a form of psychological energy that needs to be transformed. When a part of you is wounded, the energy does not disappear. It only changes form. If you suppress or avoid it, that energy returns as tension, loss of motivation, or repetitive behaviors you cannot control. But if you bring it into awareness and direct it properly, it becomes a driving force for change. The difficulty is that during a breakdown, you often see pain only as a burden. You want to escape it as quickly as possible. You look for ways to soothe your emotions, distract yourself, or return to a normal state. But in trying to escape pain, you miss the information it carries. Every negative emotion is tied to specific data. Disappointment shows that your expectations are no longer aligned. Anger shows that a boundary has been crossed. Emptiness shows that an old structure no longer creates meaning. A person who failed in business after years of investing all his time and energy fell into disorientation. At first, he saw it as a mistake to forget as quickly as possible. But when he began to review it systematically, he realized that what exhausted him was not the workload, but the fact that he had built the entire project on external validation. When the market changed, the model stopped working, and his motivation collapsed with it. By analyzing that pain, he redefined how he chose his goals, no longer based entirely on external feedback, but on clearer internal values. This is the turning point. You no longer see pain as something to remove, but as information to process. When you understand its cause, you gain the ability to reorient yourself. Instead of continuing to invest in what no longer fits, you adjust how you use your time, energy, and attention. This is when pain begins to turn into momentum. Carl Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." The development of awareness always involves a certain level of discomfort, because you must see what you once ignored. But this process creates precision in how you understand yourself. As that precision increases, your decisions become more effective. You no longer act from habit or pressure, but from a clear understanding of what truly matters. In modern psychology, this process can be understood as cognitive reappraisal, restructuring how you interpret your experiences. When you change your perspective on an event, your emotional response changes as well. This does not mean denying pain, but placing it within a framework where it has a clear function. Research shows that people who can reinterpret negative experiences tend to recover more effectively and are less likely to remain stuck. At a deeper level, pain is not something that comes to destroy you, but something like lava flowing beneath the calm surface of a mountain. When it erupts, everything appears to be burned, old structures collapse, and familiar landscapes are no longer intact. But from that heated ground, new forms begin to emerge, stronger, more stable, carrying the imprint of an irreversible transformation. Human beings are no different. When you move through pain without rushing to avoid it, you do not just change on the surface, your inner layers are reorganized. What no longer fits is gradually removed, and what truly matters becomes clearer. In practice, you can begin by writing down the experiences that led to your breakdown, not only at the level of events, but at the level of impact. What was broken? What you expected is no longer true. What you invested heavily in that did not return results. When you write these out clearly, you move from vague feeling into structured analysis. This is the first step in transforming pain into usable data. From that data, you begin to adjust your behavior. If you realize you placed all your value in one area, you redistribute it. If you see that you have ignored your personal limits, you reset them. If you recognize that you pursued goals that no longer fit, you change direction. These adjustments do not need to be large, but they must be precise. Precision matters more than speed at this stage. One important point to keep clear is that turning pain into motivation does not mean forcing it into positivity. You do not need to reframe everything optimistically. What matters is understanding and using it correctly. When you do that, motivation does not come from trying harder. It comes from no longer moving in the wrong direction. At its core, pain is a signal that there is a misalignment between how you are living and what truly fits you. When you use pain as a tool for adjustment, that misalignment gradually decreases. The result is not that you no longer face difficulty, but that you no longer repeat the same kind of difficulty. In this fourth step, the task is not to overcome pain, but to transform it. You do not push it away. You integrate it into your decision-making process. When you do this, pain no longer holds you back. It becomes part of a guidance system that moves you forward with greater clarity. Number 5. Step into your own individuation process. Individuation is not about becoming more special or different from others. It is not a journey to assert the ego. On the contrary, it is the process of gradually separating yourself from the patterns that have shaped you so that you can live according to a more accurate internal structure. In other words, you are not trying to become someone new. You are removing what is not truly you. The challenge of this stage is that it does not follow a clear path like conventional goals. You cannot create a detailed plan for becoming yourself. You cannot measure progress through external markers such as achievement or recognition. This process unfolds through small but consistent choices in how you live each day. You begin to notice what pulls you out of alignment and adjust. You begin to say no to things you once accepted just to fit in. You begin to choose directions that may not bring immediate benefit, but feel true to your inner state. A person who spent years pursuing a stable career path, after experiencing a breakdown, realized that his motivation had been driven by meeting family expectations. When rebuilding, he did not immediately switch to a completely different path. Instead, he started with smaller changes. He adjusted how he worked, reduced unnecessary commitments, and made time for areas he had long postponed. These changes did not produce immediate results, but over time, he noticed he was no longer dependent on external validation as before. This was not a leap, but a gradual restructuring. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." What is often left unsaid is that to reach that point, you must be willing to let go of many things you once believed were necessary. You let go of the need to be understood immediately. You let go of always having to explain your choices to others. You let go of measuring your worth by external standards. These acts of letting go do not happen once, but repeatedly, across different situations. From a modern psychological perspective, this process can be linked to the shift from external validation to internal validation. When you depend on external judgment, your behavior is constantly adjusted by feedback from your environment. But when you develop a clear internal frame of reference, you begin making decisions based on inner alignment rather than acceptance. This does not separate you from society. It allows you to engage more steadily because you no longer need to reshape yourself to maintain a connection. Individuation is not a finished state. It is not a destination you reach and then stop. It is an ongoing process that requires continuous awareness and adjustment. There will be times when you are pulled back into old patterns, especially under pressure or in familiar environments. The difference is that you now have enough awareness to recognize it earlier and correct it before it becomes a cycle. In practice, you can tell you are moving in the right direction when you feel less internal conflict. You no longer need to exert excessive effort to maintain a certain image. You are no longer exhausted from meeting unclear expectations. You may still face challenges, but they no longer come from living against yourself. They come from building a new structure, which always takes time.